Thank you to Brilliant.org for sponsoring this video. This is a mini handheld I assembled by myself. It's an altered version of the Pinkie Pie, a Pi Zero handheld that I'll leave a link to in the description if you're interested in making your own. And the game that's running on it was made by me over the last 90 days. Now, why is this special? Well, it's running on the Pico 8. For those who don't know what the Pico 8 is, it's a fantasy console designed to simulate limitations similar to older handhelds. It's got a 2 MHz CPU, 2 MB of RAM, a really tiny screen, and just 16 colors to work with. This basically means that you have to think well outside of the box to make some cool stuff for the Pico 8. Now, there's already some amazing showcases of the Pico 8 being pushed to its limits, but somehow, no one to my knowledge has made a decent-sized factory automation game. Two of my favorite games in that genre are Factorio and Mindustry. Just those two games I could spend hundreds of hours playing and never get bored of, and I wanted something like that for the Pico 8. So, since no one's made that game yet, and it's looking more and more like no one ever will, I decided I'd just make that game myself. So before we get started on how exactly I managed to get an automation sim working on the Pico 8, if the gameplay you've been seeing interests you, you can actually go play this game right now on my itch.io page. And for $3 more, you can get the cartridge files, source code, and all exports so you can play it on any device. I have been obsessed with the Pico 8 Virtual Console for a full year now. In fact, I had already made a mini Pi Zero handheld dedicated to playing Pico games after getting inspired by this Reddit post. But I ended up not playing it as much as I wanted because of how uncomfortable this sharp hard plastic joystick was to use. Soon after I stopped playing though, I discovered that someone had made exactly the solution I needed. A 3D printed case for the Pi that would make play sessions way more comfortable. And this is called the Pinkie Pie. And back then I let that idea drop off the radar since I also got bored of the Pico 8. But recently my addiction started to pick up again. So I decided I'd finally make the Pinkie Pie, but with some changes I wanted for myself. First up, I wanted to use a USB-C port for charging because I only have 2 micro USB cables. Meanwhile, I have hundreds of USB-C cables, so that has to change. I also wanted pass-through charging, where you can plug and play the device safely while the battery charges. Finally, I wanted a physical, hardware-based battery level display. I also decided to move the switch over to give the battery more room, and I picked a different 3-position switch because I had the idea of wiring the middle position to the battery indicator so that you can check the power level without turning on the Pi. But in the end, I ended up just not using the middle switch because I ran out of space. But perhaps if I picked up a smaller battery with a shorter cable, I could have made it work. I also ended up using a bit of hot glue to make sure the switch stays secure, which admittedly is not very confidence-inspiring. The only other mistake I made besides that is forgetting about the speaker's position next to the switch, and that resulted in me having to place the speaker sideways next to the battery connector. But besides that, I'm very happy with the results. The D-pad works flawlessly and the charging circuit works exactly as I wanted, and aesthetically, overall it came out exactly as I intended. Let's firstly lay down what it is I'm looking to do. Firstly, for me, one of the most satisfying things in Mindustry and Factorio are the conveyors, and watching your intricate creations function through these conveyors. So for me, conveyors are a must, but it's for sure going to be the most important thing to optimize, since not only does the performance need to be acceptable for even a spaghetti line of conveyors, it's also a small part of the game, so I can't let that take the most amount of frame time. Secondly, the map. While I'm not expecting it to be infinite like Factorio or even as large as some of Mindustry's maps, I also don't want it to be tiny. But this will depend entirely on how well I can optimize conveyors and factories. Lastly, I want the waves of enemies and tower defense to feel satisfying like in Mindustry. Now, spoiler alert, unfortunately I ran out of space before I could implement this, but this was the plan I had to start. So now that the basic plan was set, I got started. The first 2 days of progress was appalling. I would just stare at my screen, paralyzed by the choices I could be making. Indecision and hesitation doesn't affect me this bad usually, but I knew that I needed to be extremely careful planning out the code if I wanted any chance at succeeding. By day 4, I had rendering up and running. Originally, I planned to have all sprites palette swappable, which is why I picked such gross colors for these first few days. The following few days was just getting the drone, camera, and rendering all linked and optimized. Throughout these days, you'll see the CPU time go up and down as I add stuff and optimize other things. Like, for example, how I render the world. Instead of calling SPR for every tile, I changed it to a poke call to write out the map data directly to memory and call the map function at the end to draw it all in one go. Unfortunately, this was too token heavy, so I ended up scrapping it, which, by the way, is a pattern you'll notice a lot throughout this. I seem to get ahead of myself, then have to scrap the work once I realize that I ran out of space. By day 6, I finished off smooth and satisfying movements, and also the camera. Surely this also won't get scrapped, right? On day 8, you'll notice that I suddenly colored everything in. That's because I realized palette swapping everything on the screen would consume way too much frame time. Day 11, now it's finally time to make conveyors. Part of the reason progress was so slow for the first 2 days is because I was planning out how to do this correctly without bringing the Pico 8 to a screeching halt. But even with all that planning, it still took me almost a full week to set up the auto-tiling conveyors. So, why were the conveyors such a hassle? Well, for one, I didn't have time to do any research on this, so I was coming up with solutions on the fly. 2, the way conveyors work is so specific. At first, I thought about just looping all the conveyors and just moving items to the next spot, but you can't just do that. You need to update the conveyors in the right order, or else there'll be collision/merge conflicts. Also, since I'm working with a Pico 8, I can't brute force loop all the conveyors or items without destroying the frame rate anyways. So this is what I came up with. I call it the pulse update system. And that's because it rhythmically sends out update pulses and uses linear interpolation to cleverly hide the update interval. Here I'm visualizing the update pulse, which you can see travels 1 conveyor per frame and spawns a new pulse every 30 frames. So while the active pulse count does grow for spaghetti conveyor lines, it also avoids having to loop over the entire conveyor belt in a single frame, which the Pico 8 wouldn't be happy with. Now, if you're wondering how on earth do I come up with this stuff on the fly by myself with no help from Google or tutorials, it's called problem solving. And that's why today's sponsor is brilliant. It's not only an amazing library to give you a kickstart in any topic you're interested in, but it also helps you build up your mental toolbox of knowledge so that you can become better at problem solving. One of the best ways to learn is by doing. In fact, that's how I've gotten so far in my game dev journey, and Brilliant is built around this philosophy. It's so much more fun and effective than just reading a textbook or listening to a lecture. In turn means that you'll have an easier time building healthy learning habits. And here's the best part, they have a mobile app. So if you're like me and you like to learn things on the fly, this is perfect for you. Here's my personal recommendation for what you can start with, the Vectors course. Vector math is so important for all types of games, 3D and 2D, and it's especially important if you're getting into shaders like me. So if you're interested and want to try Brilliant, you can do so by visiting brilliant.org/aria or scanning the QR code. You'll get a full 30-day free trial and a 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks again to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. Day 29 arrives and I start implementing quality of life conveyor placement and finally get items moving on the conveyors. By this point I realized fitting everything into one cartridge would be impossible, so I had to split all the data generation into a launcher cartridge. To make this work, I spent a few days making my own encoding and decoding system to compress tables into raw bytes and then make the game unpack it on launch. This was a good call because by the end, both cartridges were completely full. So after freeing up a bunch of space in the main cartridge, I finally started implementing objects, like this drill. By day 53, I set up world generation. I also spent time planning what items and objects exist and how to pack those into Pico 8's tiny sprite sheet. And I finally caved in. There was no way I was going to finish this game on time if I had to make all the art by myself. So while I was setting up more objects like the junction, splitter, and the fuel system, Pelko worked on the art. And wow, first impressions were awesome. He ended up picking a biomechanical theme, which I immediately loved. It made the factory feel so much more unique compared to a generic factory theme. I did notice, however, that visibility was poor with the current sand color, so after some iterations, we found something that works better. By day 79, I spent some time making the palette swap system so that the same few sprites can be reused for all the ores and items. You'll also notice around this time is when work I did in the past magically starts disappearing as I needed to freeze some tokens. I had to do this so I can implement this cursor that would show you what is what, since otherwise it would be like a guessing game. But on the bright side, things are rapidly coming to a close. By day 87, I finally got the water and pipes working, and after one mad sprint for a full week, with the help of Pelko coloring in all the items, I managed to implement all the ores, items, objects, object prices, and a wallet display. Phew, that was a lot of work for such a tiny project. But it's done. My first ever complete commercial game. If you want to support me and see me make more cool things like this, please do consider buying this game or donating to me on Ko-fi. Anyways, I'll be gone for a few months while I work on the Very March Galaxy project again. So if you don't want to miss that video whenever it comes out, do subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks everyone for all your support, and I'll see you next time.